Okay, welcome to the inaugural Metacritique podcast with me, Mark Kelly, and we're joined by James Kent.
Hello, Mark. How are you?
G'day, James. Now, if you think that was an off-putting beginning, wait till you hear the rest of the content. So, it was unbelievably cold in Sydney this morning. It was unprecedentedly cold as far as I can work out. It was on the bomb app, and when I took the dog out this morning at dawn, it said 3.9 degrees. Feels like 2 degrees.
That's cold.
As far as I'm aware, like I was trying to find like news stories about this, because as far as I'm aware, that is literally the coldest it's ever been in Sydney. I don't believe it's ever been colder than 4 degrees in central Sydney before.
Really?
Maybe because Observatory Hill is what they normally go by, and I was looking at the local bomb for Newtown where I live. But yeah, that was it. Yeah, it was like properly cold. It was like they would consider this cold weather in Iceland. Like,
yeah, they would. I mean, I've never been there, but I assume they would.
No. I'm really going off on a tangent now. But in Iceland, people don't realise this about Iceland. But it has a very temperate climate because it's surrounded by water. So it doesn't get below zero that much, even though in the middle of the summer, like 15 degrees is like a normal midsummer temperature.
Right. On a slightly lesser scale, where I live in Victoria, on the Mornington Peninsula, it's much warmer in the winter than Melbourne and much cooler in the summer, which is just the temperate climate from the sea.
Yeah. Exactly, similar situation. Is it cold down south this morning?
Yeah, it's cold. It's freezing. Yeah. Not literally freezing, but I think
okay.
It's one of those things where you find that although the weather is different down here, some sort of psychologically it takes the same effect as it would say. 9 degrees here is in some way the same as sort of 4 degrees in Melbourne. Psychologically, how it affects you, I don't know. I don't know how that's the case, or that's just me, but. I find it. Are you
saying that subjective experiences are relative, James?
No, I'm not. I just think that like the spectrum of weather to which you're exposed and you experience the full emotions of weather, regardless of what those temperatures are.
Right. I feel it's kind of uncontroversial to say subjective experience is relevant. Relative. I feel like, what's the alternative?
That seems right.
They're absolute. So look, we're talking about the weather, which
it's a good start.
I'm told. I saw recently. You aware of superwog?
Yeah.
I feel uncomfortable saying the word, but you're aware of this, right?
I'm aware of superwog. Yeah.
Yeah, but the guy, and I think that the guy who does superwog, it wasn't actually a superwog thing, but I think it was him and I presume the medium was TikTok, because that's, over the last kind of year where I've been encountering most stuff.
Yeah.
Was mocking Aussies or Skips for, talking about the weather all the time. And I was unaware that this was a trait. Like, I think of this as being like an English trait, but I guess from the, Mediterranean or Middle Eastern perspective, that would be a characteristic of Anglo-Australians as well.
I feel like this is highly dubious though, because if you go, when I lived in Italy, all they talk about is the weather.
That's right, and that is canonically. We're getting into the concept here of the wog, which is like, caveat here, particularly, it's a podcast potentially could be listened to by anyone. You may not know this, James, but like wog is in the UK like basically as considered as bad a slur as the N-word, because it's specifically historically, yeah. So that word in the UK, it's not a word one hears anymore, but historically, I'll call it the W word now, because I actually am quite uncomfortable saying it for this reason. But this word was specifically used to refer to people of kind of Black African descent, and is considered like an absolutely off the chart racial slur.
Hence the Faulty Towers joke, major.
The Faulty Towers joke.
That actually makes a lot more sense now.
Yeah, which was unrepeatable in the modern day. Yet still on TV in Australia. I don't know if it'd be
because I think you would still consider it. A sort of, I don't know, minor slur here, right? Like, I wouldn't feel comfortable saying in any context. but it's clearly different to other slurs.
I mean, I think so. First, it's obviously the case with the W word is that it has, it has the general characteristic of contemporary slurs that you are allowed to use it if you are a member of that group.
Correct. Yeah.
Like hence super W word, who is able to self-ascribe, and my wife, who I shouldn't mention on the podcast at all, but is a quarter Italian, yet feels pretty comfortable self-ascribing, and I think actually that's probably allowed.
I think so.
So that's because if you're saying I am a W word, it's okay. Well, but yeah, nonetheless it's pretty acceptable. And the thing that really interests me in Australia is how in Sydney, at least, I don't know if this New South Wales thing or if it's Australia-wide, the police force have these ethnic characterizations, right? So if someone's like, a wanted suspect and they describe their ethnicity, they use this phrase in New South Wales, at least. Someone is, and I used it before in an off-color joke, that someone is of Mediterranean or Middle Eastern appearance. That's the phrase they use. And that describes the modern use of the W word, right? It's gone through historical permutations, but in the last 50 years, it describes someone who is from basically the Mediterranean.
Yeah.
And it's understood that this is a particular type, and it perfectly reasonably, right? The Mediterranean is a cultural zone, ethnically, genetically, culturally, historically, pretty kind of unified. Of course, it became very disunified due to religious, cultural differences in the last kind of 1,000 years. But prior to that, yet what interests me is in the UK, the police have two separate designations: Mediterranean and Middle Eastern, completely separate.
Really?
And there's no equivalent concept. And but you imagine, I mean, I'm thinking of France, right?
Yeah.
I once said I don't know, maybe I'm sailing into close to cancellation, but once said to a French friend that I had difficulty telling the difference between Algerian people and French people in France, right? Because in France there's a very, it's a really serious racial cleavage in French society, right? Like this is France is an extraordinarily kind of racist country in my view. It's like the most racist country I ever lived in.
I think, yeah. I mean, I've never lived there, but that seems right.
Yeah, and so they have this very clear geographical division around the kind of cities. You've got the banlieue where you have, these which are basically full of ethnic minorities, and basically there's two really sizable ethnic minorities in France. One, Arab people, predominantly of Algerian but also Tunisian, Moroccan descent, and the other one being black people who may be from the West Indies or they may be from Africa more directly. And in the French kind of mind, I mean, and talking to minority French people, even if they're French born or even third generation, if they're from an Algerian background, they don't necessarily identify as French. And it's pretty clear, how they're considered. Of course, one sees this in all kinds of countries. But I said to this French friend of mine, who is, of course, like a friend of mine, very, very liberal and politically correct, and all the rest of it, that, and actually spent a lot of her time living in the Arab world. And when I said that I couldn't necessarily recognize them, it was a time, I think, when I was living in the banlieue, so I was surrounded by a lot of people who were of Arab descent, but I couldn't necessarily tell what ethnic group someone belonged to looking at them. And my French friend was absolutely outraged that this would be the case.
I do failure to recognize it.
Yeah, the difference between but basically what I was alluding to is the difference between a Mediterranean person and a Middle Eastern person. But from a French point of view, the idea that this is a unified category, being Mediterranean or Middle Eastern, is extremely, confounding to their ethnic identity. I mean, there's this scene, there's the scene in the Battle of Algiers where they have you've seen that film, I assume. I
actually haven't, no.
Okay, well,
I know about it though.
There's a scene which I don't know how kind of historically accurate that film is. I assume the way it's presented, like very accurate. But they have a kind of a member of the kind of thing. Is it the FLN at this stage? I don't know. But one of the kind of members of the kind of Arab resistance to French colonialism, they send her into a colon only, whites only neighborhood to carry out a bombing. And I mean, basically, they just dress her up like a French person, and she passes, very easily for French. But of course, in Algerian society, there's difference between being, French versus an Arab. It's just that was prior to liberation, like like the difference between whites and blacks in apartheid South Africa.
Look, it's the thing that struck me the most about that was, it's like offers a possible correction to what I had always assumed in terms of the designator, like in Australia, of like Middle Eastern appearance. Given my age, I grew up, my teens were like the sort of early 2000s, post September 11 kind of thing, and I don't know if you remember this. I think this must have been nationally rather than statewide. But there was the fridge magnet everyone received to be alert, not alarmed.
The anti-terror fridge magnet.
Yeah. Right. And this was 2002 or 3. I can't remember exactly when it was. But this kind of trope. I mean, my memory of this is my dad taking the piss of this idea of Middle Eastern appearance. And so, of course, these days he would have been.
Did the fridge magnet say on it if someone looks like they might be French, you should stay away from them?
Remember, it can't have, but it seemed to coincide with this general sort of a man of Middle Eastern appearance was doing X, Y, Z, and of course, my dad would have been cancelled these days, but he would make jokes all the time, and no matter there was anyone who was like not white, he was sort of taking the piss of this kind of clearly racist policy, or not policy rather, but sort of approach. Right. Yeah. So, but maybe it predates. I assumed it kind of came out of that as a sort of post September 11 world, but maybe it predates that.
Well, I think, as I say, I think it's a classic move from this concept, this demonic concept that spontaneously appeared in Australia, the W word, which basically this concept emerges in a situation where you have a largely homogeneously Anglo-Celtic society, right? I mean, of course, there were Aboriginal people, but they were very systematically excluded. And into that society, you had, famously post-war, large-scale immigration from Southern Europe. And then you started to have immigration from the Middle East. And the W word, it's this very interesting kind of othering where it's like, because you still had the white Australia policy initially, these people were considered white Europeans, which they are by standard definition. Yet in a situation where they were noticeably darker and more foreign, and so that they were otherized using precisely a word that in the UK in the same time period was used for black people, who were the a new immigrant community at that time. Because they were, effectively. I mean, I don't think it's going too far to suggest that Italians in Australia in the 1950s were in the same kind of social position that West Indian immigrants were in the UK. It's not to say they were as discriminated against necessarily in every respect, but this kind of the same kind of otherization seems to be operative.
I think that sounds right, but that's extraordinary. I didn't actually know the history of that word in the UK. I didn't realise that. I actually thought I don't want to return to the Fawlty Towers joke, but that actually gives a lot more context, and actually the joke is much more outrageous than I believed.
Yeah, right. I mean, well, no, but how could it be more outrageous? It uses the N word, right? Like,
but
isn't it already?
But he uses the N word and the W word, right? Yeah. And we won't go on to it, but that joke now has a lot more context and makes a lot more sense. Yeah. I mean,
it's extraordinary, really, the levity with which we're getting onto racial issues in this conversation, because we're, absolutely ignoring the conjuncture we're in, or at least the kind of the apparent conjuncture. I mean, because we're actually in Australia, and this is happening in America. Like we're seeing America. I take it still today, like in the midst of this paroxysm of, I mean, what to call it? Like, I don't really know what to. Is there like a summary word that's
for the riots?
Yeah, for I guess the riots is the.
I think it's still called riot or protest.
But I think protest is what is a broader heading. But in fact, that if it were merely protesting, it wouldn't be the historic moment that I think it's been taken to be.
No, that's right.
Because it's seen like there have been urban rebellions in the United States, but I don't know if they're still ongoing. I mean, like the fact that a police station was burned, this kind of. I mean, that's
not protest. I mean, it is.
Well, it is. No. Of course, protest is a fair umbrella description, but it also describes things that when people march with placards, which is also going on in the United States. But I think that people marching with placards against police killings is a commonplace occurrence, just as police killings in the United States are common, or anywhere. Indeed.
I guess I mean more. I mean, it's not protest that's familiar to the kind of liberal democratic person. So that, which is not to say that it isn't protest, but it's more that they see the minute one isn't holding placards and doing something more, then they see this as some kind of overextension or some kind of going too far.
Well, I think that's right. Although, I mean, actually, this moment has seen, I think, some kind of fracturing of that. So it's definitely the case that you can find like kind of small L liberal capital D Democrats in the United States who precisely have said, this is excessive, it's gone too far with the protests that have turned violent. But I think there's also a reaction on the liberal left in America that has been broadly supportive, even of.
I think that's right.
The violence, and I think that's in itself something kind of new. I mean, I take it that the reflex there is really that there's an unwillingness now. I mean, if I put it this way, the liberal left in the United States now are woke enough that they will not or realize that they shouldn't criticize Black people's responses to police violence as being too violent, because that in itself would be racist, and therefore they've checked themselves and are kind of supportive. Sorry.
No, I was going to say that there's a kind of impasse there too, because I think you're right in the sense that so the kind of liberal white American has gone that far to acknowledge this and to acknowledge the kind of, I guess, the historical moment, as you might call it, but. They also have to fall. You see again and again they fall back on these kind of platitudes, which the solution is kind of somehow reforming the police or something like this. These kinds of fairly liberal, fairly toothless solutions. I mean, clearly, because if you recognise the problem here is that if you recognise the actual qualms that the Black community are having here, then fixing the police this isn't solve the problem. I mean, it may solve a dimension of it, but this isn't the solution. So there's a kind of impasse there, I think, in liberal sort of left-wing politics in America.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to sarcastically, but I tend to think the problem with the liberal position is their representationalism. That is, they think everything's about representation. And I have said, I'm not sure if in print, but I have said that that liberals would be happy as long as the police were killing an equal proportion of Black and white people. But this police killing is not the issue. It's the implicit racism or discrimination in police killing. Right. And that's the impasse they want to get over. Like they don't want to change the basic mechanisms of the system. They want to change the proportionality.
That's right. Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's exactly right. I mean, what's your take on the? I mean, I guess we can call them protests. What's your take on them more broadly? I mean, you've said that you think there is a genuine historical moment, but I mean, what's your take on them? I know that's a huge.
Yeah, but here's. I mean, this actually. So I neglected to say what I wanted to say at the beginning, which actually, and I've overridden it now. So it's almost like I can't say this, but I wanted to say, like, we're here as professional philosophers, basically, and I actually, probably should have mentioned that at the beginning of the podcast, like. At least if not, I mean, we're both like literally earn our living through doing philosophy. I think your teaching is in philosophy.
I do. I mean, yeah, I would call myself probably semi-professional, but yeah. I think that's...
Well, yeah, but that's because you're. I mean, without putting too fine the point, you're only semi-employed. But
yeah, that's right.
Yeah, but I mean, that's in these days, whomst among us. But I think, but we're also credentialed philosophers, so we have the PhDs and
correct.
The
so what were you going to say?
I was going to say, so I'm really fucking dancing around this, aren't I? What I was going to say is, like, it is really cringe, and I'm opposed to it when philosophers try to talk philosophically in real time about current events.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I mean, that actually is a caveat. And, in a sense, what I say about this is, like, we need to acknowledge what's going on in the United States, but I also kind of don't want to touch it because as a philosopher, like, of course, people have to talk about this. But I think, there's two things. One is that I think the impossibility, and this also goes for the COVID-19 pandemic, which is the other event that was still, actually coinciding with the political events in the United States, and not merely coinciding. I think it's pretty clear that, the pandemic led to state actions which in themselves have really seriously catalyzed this. I find it very hard to believe that this would have broken out in the same way at the same time if it hadn't been for and in fact, the economic shock. That's probably that both the lockdown seems to maybe, and people have been saying that the lockdowns contributed to it because there's pent-up frustration, people hadn't been able to leave the house. But I think probably more to the point, the unemployment levels, the fact that communities with already high unemployment levels now have that's not stratuspheric high employment levels. Yeah, so that's got to be. If you're having an urban rebellion in the United States, the fact that people don't have money, they don't, in this acutely bad situation, and have, of course, that's going to catalyze looting, and of course, it's going to. And I think that it's important to insist on that economic dimension, is precisely because of the liberal reflex to turn everything into identity politics and ignore the infrastructure. But having said all that, again, I can't help myself talking about it, and we have to talk about it, obviously. But I think so. The intellectualization and theoretization of this has to wait. And also, I think the talking is it comes from this horrible reflex. I don't want to be too critical of it. Obviously, it has good intentions, but this horrible reflex of the social media, everyone turned their profile pictures black on Tuesday. My entire Instagram feed was black images, except for one guy who posted an image of the names of people murdered by the police and criticised from the left the black images, which is immediately something you saw people criticising this from the left. But I think there's a reflex there you see in everyone with an Instagram account, which you also see in philosophers, which is that they believe, people want to believe that their mundane, completely ineffectual existence is able to influence political events. So people, what people do is take photos of their lunch and put it on Instagram. They believe that by swapping the picture of their lunch with a political picture, they're engaging in political praxis. And the philosopher, wants to say, the thing I do is philosophy, so I'm going to do philosophy which will change the world. And I think in both cases they're wrong. People need to acknowledge how ineffectual they are. And specifically, this gets back to what I was saying at the beginning, here we are sitting in Australia, and the reflex of people in Australia, at least like the kind of woke people I know, is to not let the fact that we're not in America in any way prevent us from believing we're conducting meaningful interventions in American society's problems. But we are not there. We're not able to participate meaningfully in what's happening there at all. We're really observed. And
I think that's right. And I think the first thing to say from my perspective, and this is kind of very much my take on a lot of things, is that, as you say, it's too early. But I think that actually has to be a really rigorous theoretical position, in the sense that no one has any idea what's going on. And I think that has to be recognized as that's not ambivalence or kind of a failure to sort of formulate a position. It's a kind of empirical and theoretical fact. And that's one point. So I have no idea what to make of it, really none, other than the kind of usual platitudes that you'll hear from anyone. The other thing too, in regards to the Australian dimension, I had a text from a friend yesterday. I think this might be the first time I've ever been asked my opinion on a kind of theoretical sort of problem from a friend. I think, and I don't know whether she asked me because I'm in inverted commas a philosopher, but she did ask me this. And anyway, her qualm was she there's a big rally on Saturday in Melbourne, about sort of a sort of Black Lives Matter rally, but it's organised by local Indigenous people, and it was it was originally organised by some young African Australian women, right, originally, and then the local Indigenous community basically said, you can't organise this without us, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, her problem, my friend's problem was she wanted to go on the one hand as a sign of solidarity, but on the other, her concern was basically what you just said. There's a kind of, this is a fundamentally different country and a different problem. Like you cannot make the connection. And basically it ends up being a kind of fairly cringy attempt by, generally speaking, white left liberals to kind of, make these kind of weird signaling in regards to America, while also ignoring all the sort of problems in your own backyard. And also her other problem, which is to say, what about all the people being, for example, the obsession with Trump and Biden being an accused rapist or whatever it might be. And as she said, obviously on the one hand, that's terrible. Well, on the other hand, who gives a shit what this man has personally done if he's going to keep on bombing the Middle East, right? Like, so the idea was, in sort of overall, her concern was, we're concerned with some, black bodies and not others. It was her claim. And I had no actual answer for her, but there does seem to be an element of hypocrisy, at least in Australia.
Yeah, it's a tricky one, to say the least. I mean, it's definitely the case. I think we can recognise analytically that. I mean, it's part of the kind of cultural genuflection reflex in Australia towards America. That, I mean, there is an effect. So, firstly, there's an attempt to have protests specifically about the killing in America's. Was it George Floyd? I want to make sure I got his name right. Yeah, the first reflex was to have protests. It seems to me, and I presume it's by usual suspects like white leftists, mostly white leftists. Of course, I shouldn't say that the left in Australia is exclusively white by any means, but given it's a majority white country, the left is also mirrors that. But yeah, so white leftists want to have protests about the killing of George Floyd in America. I mean, it's like a dialectic. So the next move, the next, that immediately invites the criticism that what are you doing in Australia protesting against the killing of George Floyd when the police kill Aboriginal people all the time in Australia?
Correct.
Where's the outrage about that? And then it transforms into protests about police killings in Australia. But the only reason there are protests about police killings in Australia is because something happened that they saw on social media, etc., in America, that made them think, oh, maybe there's a problem here. And I mean,
No, I'm sorry to interrupt. I just think it's a kind of hollowing out of this kind of the political as a sphere, right? So there's this, all it is this kind of, what I said to my friend was it's a kind of binary reaction to events, right? So X happens, and so you reply in sort of in a particular way. And as you say, so on the one hand, it begins as a Black Lives Matter problem, and then it becomes, I think rightly, a sort of a recognition of Aboriginal deaths in custody in Australia. But as my friend pointed out, her sort of broader point was this only happens as a reaction to something else, right? There's no actual space in which praxis can actually occur. She didn't put it in those terms, but that was kind of what she was saying. And then, of course, there's the kind of broader Western imperialist point, which is to say, what about everyone else who's being murdered as we speak, which are just basically ignored except for kind of tokenistic acknowledgement?
Yeah, I mean, that point...
Sorry, until something happens on the internet which requires us to do something about it.
No, I mean, this point is very, very much my shtick. I mean, this is, my pre-prepared reaction to this, which is, what I said in the Biopolitical Imperialism book that I put out, whatever it was, 5 years ago now, that in the United States, there's very clearly a divide between, the valuation of black and white lives, and that is absolutely, brilliantly named by the Black Lives Matter movement, the fact that black lives are considered less valuable or treated as less valuable in some systematic way in the United States. But for all that black lives in the United States are treated as less valuable than white lives, they're treated as much more valuable than the lives of people outside the United States. The
Right.
US, the American state is, kills people with far more impunity. I mean, it's these, cops typically kill black people in America and get away with it, but at least there's some possibility, as we're seeing now, of them being held to account. Rare though it may be, there's a framework. American soldiers killing people overseas. I mean, again, there is the barest possibility of them being held to account for it, but by and large, that's much more literally what they're to do. And if we can criticize the US police, as people are rightly doing, for essentially being there to oppress and kill black people, I mean, that's true, but it's not true to the same extent. American soldiers are literally employed primarily to kill people. That's their primary purpose, and there's no confusion about that at all. I mean, it's absolutely literally what they're employed to do. Yeah. And that's right. There's a striation. I mean, there's various. I mean, it's not a single binary division between white and non-white, which actually is a really popular leftist reflex to say, I saw people, kind of Palestine activists, immediately drawing the connection between, and it's a real connection. It's not merely an analogy. It's a real connection between the US state's treatment of black people and the Israeli state's treatment of Palestinian people. Nonetheless, I don't think you should assimilate them in the sense that the Palestinian people are killed by the Israeli military in a much more flagrant way. I mean, with fewer consequences. So the situation in United States for black people, bad though it is not that. I struggle to think what the overall point here is. I mean, obviously it's this is not to say that we can't be concerned about this because there's a worse evil. I mean, that's obviously a fallacious form of reasoning, but
it's funny you mention evil because I mean, I don't know I mean. You might be skeptical about the idea. I'm not sure, but a friend of mine said the other day that despite the obvious hypocrisies at play in the protesting and all this kind of stuff, or one of the reasons why the death of George Floyd has catalyzed this response, or at least one possible reason, is that because it was collectively witnessed on social media. There's very kind of shocking footage of it. There is a kind of I don't know whether I believe this or not, but it's a really kind of collective witnessing of an evil act of evil, and I think that's one reason that catalyzes this response, and I think that's one very understandable reason for the response from all sort of walks of life. It is, and you can, although the political and socio-cultural elements are important and have to be acknowledged, there's also just the kind of, perhaps a slightly cringy take, but there's this witnessing of what human beings can do to other human beings, and that I take to be a sort of evil act, and which I think explains, at least to some extent, the response.
I think that's right. I think with the George Floyd killing, I think it's unique and singular in exactly what we saw, and this differentiates it from police killings in general of black people in the United States because they're not filmed in the same detail. And I mean, I take it there's almost a kind of banality of evil effect with the killing of George Floyd because the cops kill him not by shooting him or but simply by kneeling on him.
Yeah,
and it's looking so calm as they do it, which is kind of uniquely horrifying, right? The idea
it's the other cops overlooking it, just standing there. I think that plays a huge role.
Yeah, I think that's right. The sheer kind of palpable indifference in the killing is horrifying in itself, and uniquely, like it's a new horror. Like seeing cops shoot a fleeing black man, or doesn't have the same shock because we've seen it before. And this is, and I think there's, I mean, in a sense, like if we were looking at it rationally, that doesn't make sense because there's, it doesn't have a unique moral character at a kind of rational level, but at an affective level, like in terms of the spectacle, it's right. It's explanatory. It explains why people, around the world are so horrified and outraged about it. But I mean, getting back to the analogous issue with Aboriginal people in Australia, police killings of Aborigines, that is much less visible, right? So, because the typical situation in Australia of killing of Aboriginal people is not being gunned down on the street, but death in custody, which greatly reduces the possibility of it being filmed.
Yeah, that's right.
And
it basically eliminates it.
Yeah. So that means that it's invisible, but it's not just that. I mean, it occurs to me as well that there's the invisibility of Aboriginal death is also for political reasons, in that, in America, there is, at least since the civil rights movement, a well-organized, both within the black community and without, activist base who are seeking to publicize this stuff. And, black people make up whatever it is, 15% of the population of the United States. We're talking about, a population of tens of millions of people who are, culturally cohesive, have their own institutions and movements. Aboriginal people in Australia are closer to 1% of the population. We're talking about 250,000 people spread out across this landmass who don't have anywhere near the same resources. So the possibility of this becoming an issue in the United States is vastly higher. And I mean, from that point of view, I think it's kind of legitimate for this to be mobilized it's absolutely legitimate for Aboriginal people to try to, use this moment to bring public focus to the plight of Aboriginal people in Australia, because, they simply don't, without leveraging the publicity that it gets to the US, there's no possibility to do it.
I think that's exactly right. And I agree completely. And I think despite the kind of qualms we might have about the ways in which, say, for example, white Australia engages in politics and how that functions with the internet, this kind of stuff, that's all legitimate too. But as you say, Indigenous groups and leaders, they see value in connecting the current protests to their own struggles, and they see the value in that. And it seems to be working. So you can't say anything more than that. It seems to be working, and if it captures the imagination, then that's good. Yeah,
that seems fair. But I mean, I take it that the problem with the protests in Australia, actually, there's a really clear problem. It's that they're illegal because of the pandemic countermeasures, right?
Right.
So I mean, that's been an issue in the United States as well. But I mean, looks. I mean, I feel in the American situation, the urgency of the situation just overrides that, and it overrides it in fact. People are going to go out the street and protest and loot, and the fact that they're doing that, like the fact that you're worried about, and people are worried. I mean, there's people are sounding alarm about, okay, this is going to be a major spreading event for COVID-19.
Yeah.
But yeah, you kind of can't be concerned about that. But the situation in Australia, because it's in Australia, right, and it's in fact an echo of the American situation, and it's much less easy to make the case that we need to have public gatherings right now, and that therefore it's legitimate to do this even though it's illegal, and because it's not a matter of spontaneous anger. I mean, one of the I've seen this as a kind of right-wing criticism of protests in London, and I think it's not totally wrong, that in the sense that, unlike the protests in the United States, which were genuinely spontaneous, that there's, and despite the kind of discourse that Trump himself has been tweeting, that obviously he's not creative enough to think up himself, but this discourse that actually it's like all the George Soros plot, like that. Obviously, that's not the case in the United States. I'm not saying that it's a George Soros plot anyway, but I think in other situations, because it's gone through the vector of the organised left actually trying to put on protests, I think, there is a kind of, I mean, ordinarily that would be much less concerned, but I feel in the current situation, like it's also like kind of weirdly counterproductive in the current situation, in the sense that, you know, you're much less likely. I mean, from a purely strategic point of view, you're much less likely to get public sympathy behind a protest that you hold right now in contravention of you know, public gathering laws against this than you would ordinarily.
Yeah, that seems right. And I mean, I also have been following the kind of right-wing criticisms of this of these events, and one of them was kind of, it's an obvious point, but it is true in the sense that if you remember a few weeks ago when the protests against the lockdown were occurring in, you know, generally from the kind of libertarian right, and they were all, I mean, I think rightly in some ways, ridiculed for just kind of, you know, drastically increasing the chance of contracting COVID-19. And just in general, the whole thing was ridiculed. And then, of course, the right-wing criticism is, you know, you don't hear a word of that in regards to the current protests. Right? If anything, there's encouragement for people to get involved. I don't think they're comparable, because, as you say, one is spontaneous, the one isn't really. I
mean, I'm not sure that's really. Yeah, because I think the right-wing protests are also somewhat spontaneous in the sense. I mean, it's hard because, I mean, what is the kind of authentic spontaneity?
What is spontaneity? Yeah, sure.
But I think there's you know, in a sense, those protests did occur spontaneously because, geez, like, a lot of people like weren't happy about being locked down, and if you put the lockdown together with, you know, conspiracy-based disbelief in the virus or the efficacy of the lockdown.
Yeah.
Once you put, if you don't believe the virus is real, then when people tell you can't leave the house, like, you're going to be pretty pissed off. Like, I feel like that's kind of unfair. I mean, actually, the US case is a bit different because you clearly had like official political encouragement for protests in the United States against the lockdown, which in a sense means they were less spontaneous because they were more orchestrated. But I mean,
it's one of those things. I mean, to go back to your original point, is that it's really cringe when philosophers have a take on this, and then we've talked about it for 25 minutes, which is terrible. But I like to think that we've been ambivalent enough to not be accused of making any serious conclusions.
That is absolutely brilliant. So it's fine that we talked about this at length because we said absolutely nothing.
Correct. Yeah, we made no conclusions of any substance.
Yeah. I mean, and at least we're not kidding ourselves about that fact. Like, we admit it. We admit that we are ineffectual and vacuous in our remarks. Therefore,
but it comes down to that kind of that radical point that we have no idea what's going on. I think that's true.
I mean, but actually, so we get the real. I mean, getting really philosophical here. Like, how different though is this epistemologically relative to our normal situation? Like, because I mean, my first reflex, what I said, and you're vociferously agreeing with me, is like philosophy. I mean, the take I have is like philosophy can't be done in real time. Like, this kind of urge to, like, you know, this urge to like commentate on current events, which I have, is, you know, really dumb, because at least to do it at a philosophical level, I mean, you can commentate on current events, but you're not being a philosopher. If you're gonna be philosophical, you know, let's wait like a few hundred years. You know, we need to really, you know, get our heads around what's happening. Okay, that's fine. But then how much do we? I mean, really, if you wait a few hundred years, like, how much do we really know, like, about any of it? Like, how is? You know what I mean?
I think I do. Are you saying that you can only philosophize about things hundreds of years later?
Well, that was my initial thesis.
And you have to wait for world spirit to settle? Is that kind of the idea?
Yeah, that's not what I'm saying, or wasn't what I was trying to say. No, because it's not that. The idea is that, I mean, look, you know, I have problems all along the line with this. I mean, actually, I mean, I've also got problems with philosophy, as it frequently is done. I mean, you know, out loud. I mean, I think, you know, philosophy to me, it's really properly a kind of written discipline. Like, the philosophy requires like gestation, commentary. Like, you need to have it before you and logically, you know, go through what you're talking about. and assemble the, if we're going to have some empirical aspect, we need to be careful about it. But actually, I mean, my thought here is going further, which is like, from an epistemological perspective, like, I'm not sure we should be talking about the empirical at all from a philosophical point of view. Like, I'm not sure. I mean, I've just imploded here. I'm sorry. I've like,
It's fine.
We're recording it, and because the end to this thought process, which to be honest is where I'm at with this now, is that philosophy is bunk and is of no use to anyone in any context. So I don't know what my reticence is here, other than a purely professional one.
Yeah, I mean, no, but I mean, I've heard this line from you before, and I think like I mean, the first part of your talk, of your, I guess it was almost a rant. It's close to my heart because, and I've been accused of this many times. Is this kind of like radical ambivalence as part of my philosophical position, right? Which often is just hiding the fact that I have no idea what's going on, and I think that's true. It's a kind of coping mechanism. But I also
isn't it the opposite? Isn't it that everyone else is talking to hide the fact they have no idea what's going on, and you're the one who will admit it?
I mean, possibly that's possibly true. But I mean, I also very strongly believe that having serious doubts about basically everything is the only defendable position. Like I really do think that. I don't go as far as you to think that philosophy is bunk. Maybe that's just because I've been doing it for less time than you, and I'm just still naive, right? But I agree with you that philosophy is basically or at least in my world, it's basically a written and it's basically reading and writing for me. It's like for me, it's also like an extremely kind of private endeavor. So which makes me sound like a weirdo, which is probably accurate. But I'm at my, as I'm sure is becoming clear, I'm at my weakest talking about philosophy out loud, and I don't do it very often, and I don't really enjoy it. I'm enjoying it now, but I do think there is that kind of Socratic element in me, which still wants to defend philosophy as capable of doing something quite vital.
Yeah. No, this is really interesting. Really getting to the nub of it, right? Which is the Platonism. I mean, this is what it always comes back to when we talk from your side. Is a kind of commitment to Platonism. I mean,
no, it's not. This is really recent for me. Like I've only realized in the last 2 weeks that maybe I'm actually a Platonist, like rather than just being a joke.
Because this is before you read Badiou.
Correct. Yeah, before I read Badiou, but I mean, my thesis is basically was kind of insane because basically all of the thinkers I dealt, not all of them, but all of the thinkers I dealt with, or many of them, the ones I dealt with, were kind of anti-Platonic, right? But then my conclusion was on Plato, and I think that conclusion was only like 4,000 words, but I think it really fucked me up, like because I think because I reread the Republic and I had this kind of horrific, and that was last year, and now it's just been in the back of my head. And then I read Badiou, and then I've been reading some Hans Jonas as well, which is kind of very Aristotelian, and I'm like, no, this is clearly wrong.
You see, this is interesting. I mean, we need to unpack this, and probably over the course of many years. But I mean, because as you know, like I'm on the Aristotelian tip, and have been forever, really. Like I still cannot feel sympathy with Plato, but I'm willing to accept though that maybe this is where I need to go, because where I've been is down this road. I mean, obviously with Foucault, right? Marx and Foucault, right? I mean, Marx, you have this, and I was thinking about it before. We're talking about the practical stakes of philosophy. You've got the 11th thesis on Feuerbach, which says famously, philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point is to change it, right? And that's Marx. And what Marx does is like, okay, he's got a PhD in philosophy, and then he goes off and tries to change the world, and is successful, although in a slightly ambivalent way. And then you've got Foucault, who says, what is philosophy today? And this is Foucault's late work, and he spends most of his life kind of, he has a philosophical education, but that's really just because he's French. Like his PhD is in philosophy, but you're French, you do a PhD in philosophy. What are you going to do? But he then goes off and does basically stuff that doesn't look that much like philosophy for 2 decades. But in the end, he kind of goes back and says, yeah, I'm a philosopher. But philosophy today can only mean the study of the relationship between politics and truth, right? The truth aspect is what makes it philosophical. but it has to be political because we're in this post-Marxist, post-thesis 11 age where you can't do a non-political form of philosophy. And this is what this is the song sheet I've been singing for years, which is, philosophy has to be politically engaged, even though I don't think it can take place in real time. Like I think, so, but Foucault, as always, was the template for me, because Foucault's like this guy who, is trying to influence the present, but he does it by studying history. So, Foucault's books basically deal with stuff that is, no more recent than 100 years, which is why I'm saying that. It's not because I'm a Hegelian, it's because I'm a Foucauldian. So I'm like, well, we need to look at stuff where we know what's happening. And that is a really serious problem with trying to deal with anything, that's happening now, because in really important senses we don't know. In a kind of trivial empirical sense, like a lot of what's going on now, we don't know what's going on. I mean, that's why, we can have these conspiracy theories and we're not sure if they're true or false, because the dust hasn't settled and we don't really know what happened. But the thing is that, as you know, my position on a whole bunch of things has been thrown into really significant flux recently. And I'm not sure what I think about this, because I'm tempted now to commit to a much more radical skepticism than that, which is going to say, well, how do we know, any of this stuff ever happened? I mean, how do we know that our historical evidence is? I mean, and indeed we don't, right? We don't. I mean, as if. I mean, if something's happened 100 years ago, I mean, it allows it to appear much more clear, because you develop a canonical set of archival materials that define the event. But that's simply, I mean, a lot of that is the disappearance of conflicting evidence and so on. When things are recent, you've got you'll always have a complicating narrative. So, I mean, so my thought is like, which is what I was voicing before you characterize it as almost a rant. I mean, I characterize it really as an intellectual implosion. And where do we, I mean, but maybe we just go back to Plato, and precisely because Plato is not an empiricist. So for Plato, like, it's about mathematics. It's not about, the study of praxis. Unlike for Aristotle, who's very practically oriented. But maybe you have something else to say.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's right. Like, and the thing that's awkward about this is that, my instincts are on the one hand Aristotelian, right? And on the other hand, deeply Platonic. And this is something that I haven't realized I've been grappling with until recently. Even though, I read The Republic when I was like 16, it was one of my first introductions to philosophy, blah, 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 blah. But because the awkward thing here is I actually don't know Plato super well. Like, I've read the kind of classic text, but I'm not in any way a Plato expert. But I guess, but there's part of me that wants to kind of hold on to this idea of, to use a kind of colloquial term, not colloquial, but kind of a bit of I don't know. I believe in truth, beauty, justice. Like I actually do. And the part, and I think we both watched that Baju doco the other day. The bit, and I was interested that he emphasized this, because I emphasized this at the end of my thesis too, and which is in the allegory of the cave. So you have this kind of this incredibly famous metaphor for the sudden witnessing of the good and the true, right? And people talk about this, but of course, as Baju points out, what often isn't mentioned is that Plato says you have to go back in the cave, right? Like, there has to be. I mean, and he interprets this as a kind of call to praxis, at least from what I understand it. I mean, I'm new to Baju, right? But no, go on.
This is not my memory of the Republic, right? Like, maybe I'm, as part of this, like,
you don't remember the bit where he tells you to go back into the cave.
But doesn't he say? But he says you can leave the cave fully. Like, you can go. Like, you don't have to go back. Like,
yeah. Now I can't remember. I'll have to double check. But my understanding of it is that to actually sort of to engage with the good, you've actually got to go back. So that's actually, I mean, that a lot hangs on that. So I should double check that.
But Badiou says this. He
does say this. Yeah, he says you got to go back into the cave, and he makes a big deal. In the doco, yeah. Cool. And I mean, more broadly, is that it seems to me is that, I mean, I share, because I also have a kind of streak of skepticism, which are perhaps not as extreme as yours, but you know, it's fairly robust. But I also want to fall back on this idea that there are these kind of orientating concepts. But I'm at the very beginning of trying to work out this tension, so I don't really know what else to say at this point, because it's still very much a puzzle in my head.
I think that's probably honestly a good point to stop.
All right.